I was not satisfied with how we put messaging out there. It was called broken promises of international law.
How do you see the connection between filmmaking, diplomacy, and education?
That's not usually what the judge says to you, okay? That the international community and the international law is no longer just based on states, but on people. And that resilience, they didn't film.
What is the main message you would like to leave with them?
It's not the law that's the problem. It's the politics. It was the international community that failed Palestine. And how can you think about human rights if you don't think about human beings?
Your film, As For Whom, I quote, international law matters.
Nobody knew about international law, and nobody makes films about international law. I mean, if presidents of the biggest power in the world break their constitution.
Why are Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular important regions for discussing international law today?
How do you present issues that are not mainstream, maybe? 70% of them don't say anything. I hear new things and I see the world a bit differently afterwards.
Why do you think the topic of international human rights law is so often overlooked?
Not advocacy, it's just pure communications, and we know how manipulated media are. Law in practice, to me, is an awareness.
And what, in your view, caused this change in narrative?
I'm being very dramatic here. Well, if we don't have wars anymore, I think we'll have good progress made, okay?
Today we are speaking with Stefan Ziegler, Associate Professor at the Geneva School of Diplomacy and International Relations, humanitarian practitioner and documentary filmmaker at Advocacy Productions in Geneva. With over 25 years of experience at the ICRC, UN and OSCE, he's currently on a Central Asian tour, bringing lectures, film screenings and discussions to promote his vision of international law as a language for peace. Hello. So this is not your first visit to Uzbekistan. Previously you were here as an OSCE election observer. Now you're returning in a different capacity as a lecturer and filmmaker presenting your documentary film. How does this feel different compared to your previous visits? And what do you hope to achieve through your series of lectures and training sessions in Uzbekistan?
Well, thank you for having me, first of all. Yes, you're correct. 2 times I was here, like 11 months ago, and I think it's about 4 years before that. I was posted, oddly enough, as an election observer twice in Fergana, which is a surprise to me. We usually don't end up in the same place. So I can't tell you much about your country other than the Fergana Valley, and which I enjoyed a lot because I like this. It's very diverse in terms of agriculture and so on. I think I've seen all the fruits that I know growing down there, so this is wonderful. I also felt the people were very nice, and Tashkent is the first time. Well, this time, as you said it earlier on yourself, I think it's different in the sense that we are working with the Swiss government, the Embassy of Switzerland, who's hosting me and implementing a project on international law with its different facets, and I'm sure we'll go into this during the interview. But that is, the way I express my own experience as a humanitarian worker, but also as a lecturer now and so on in film. Mm-hmm. And these are the films or the film materials with which I'm coming here now, and that is where the major difference is from previous visits.
I see. And why are Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular important regions for discussing international law today?
Okay, you will forbid me for the fact that I'm saying this is not a first world country or region. And I believe showing my film work based on international law finds a lot more ready audiences in countries where they have experienced maybe calamities, unrest and so on, things that are relative to or relevant to international law, whereas in the so-called first world there's very little resonance. So when I do film work, I do film work in conjunction with research. Mm-hmm. So each time that I go somewhere, like Uzbekistan, I hear new things and I see the world a bit differently afterwards. And I hope that will make it into my new film work. in the future.
In your view, what are the main challenges related to the protection of international law or human rights in developing countries, especially in the region? And what issues tend to be overlooked and deserve greater attention?
I can't, as an individual or an individual filmmaker, I'm not covering the whole palette of international law. In any case, that's in the case books and so on, and other people are doing great work, especially on human rights films and so on. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to highlight the importance of international law relative to conflict, to people who, as we said, are open to that, but also because I strongly believe, and this goes for the whole world, it doesn't matter where we are, that we need to strengthen international law if it's to stand a chance in surviving, at least in its principles, and for whom, like 1.5 centuries of thinkers and lawyers and experts have worked towards, and we're seeing deteriorating, at least the implementation of those laws. So that's my first and foremost aim and goal and motivation.
We will touch this later. And from your experience, it's said that you use a triple approach to promote awareness of international law, combining education, advocacy, and audiovisual storytelling. What inspired you to develop this method, and why do you believe it's effective?
Okay, so my 25 years in humanitarian environments and work have taught me to use evidence base, so the facts, and that includes the international law and rulings at World Court, or other such tribunals and so on, in order to be able to have a really good understanding, because advocacy without that is not advocacy. It's just pure communications, and we know how manipulated media are nowadays and so on. So I'm a strong believer that if you want to survive with a good, strong message, it has to be based in evidence, and then of course film helps with that. So this is a little bit where this all comes in. The film work itself is the third one that you mentioned, is really about, well, if you see a bad movie, you will not remember it because it was bad. And it's not just for the story, it's also that maybe it's not well made, and so on and so forth. So I think if we put a lot of evidence into film work, which of course draws also on the emotions and so on, then that, and the quality of that film work is good, we have a better chance to get the messages out for advocacy purposes, basically. Maybe you asked me about education at the same time?
Yes,
Yeah.
and my second question is related to education as well. And based on your observations, what are the main tendencies or challenges in human rights education, particularly in countries like Uzbekistan?
Okay, that I'm not sure myself, because this is not something that I concentrate on so much. I don't do research into 200 countries in the world's human rights approaches. I know what the human rights approaches are through the United Nations. I think they are the strongest, educators, if you wish, and with other agencies, that do that kind of work and make it available in curricula the world over. So there's very little I can say about that itself, but of course education is one of those three parts, if you wish, of my existence in work. But education for me is not an end in itself. So if you take some example of international law being not implemented or being abused and so on, then the evidence needs to be clearly defined. You film it, and through education you can reach people. I can't reach people through the common media because we simply wouldn't have time to do this. You need a promoter or a TV station. And then you limit yourself to one station.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to do this through the university systems, the school systems. So this is how we broaden out the kinds of educational film work that we do.
And do you have any recommendations to strengthen the understanding of international law among youngsters and children?
I think it's not the children that have to be reminded to strengthen this. It's us, adults, people in positions that have a responsibility to get young people to think about, current affairs and so on. I think the responsibility is really on filmmakers, in my case, maybe. Advocacy is a tool, but filmmakers have a certain role to play, and more, because everybody has access to a screen at any time of the day and so on. The recommendation would rather be, to the media also. How do you present issues that are not mainstream maybe, but they are important and they're of ethical value? And how do we get that out? And I think by you providing me with the space here, you're doing this, so that's kind of my thinking.
And you work with students, right? You do trainings for students. How do you view your students? What defines them? And what do you think today's generation brings to the study of international law and filmmaking, maybe?
Today's?
To the study of international law and advocacy, filmmaking in this area.
Yeah. Okay. Students are not equal students, right? I mean, yesterday I was one of your universities, and when 70% of them don't say anything, they're not the same as the 30% that really actively engage, although they study the same thing, they're in the same year and so on. Now it could be that, English is a second language for them, and that hampers some of them, surely. And then some young people I think they're overwhelmed with all the social media stuff. They are really no longer capable of dissecting what's good for them and so on. Everything becomes fleeting. And that I feel also in my students back home, where I teach regularly as an associate professor. It's like, I think they're, sorry to say, but in a way they're a lost generation. They are not capable anymore, largely, to concentrate on, say, a text, if it's more than 2 lines long. So I have to write my students 3 emails, in this case, if I have 3 questions. If I write one with 3 questions in it, I'm lucky to get the first one answered. And this is a generational problem. This is a problem I think has to be addressed anyway. But maybe we can get back to something else, even a bit later on, that has to do with the media and the teaching of international law. I'd be very happy to go back to that.
Okay, and finally, when we talk about strengthening international law in practice, what does that mean to you? How can societies translate legal principles into tangible progress?
Well, if we don't have wars anymore, I think we'll have good progress made, okay? I know this is very flippant, but in fact, that is an indicator, the biggest. If the violence goes down and the understanding that we have rights, even in wars, I think that would be a really good step forward and to understand whether we've done a good job or not. At the moment, it points the other way, right? And so, seeing as I'm a practitioner, the question is to me, and I take it as such, because I know that law in a courtroom, international law, a library, maybe even in the head of a professor, looks very, very different from, we have a few pictures of the world around here that depict the vulnerability of people. And I think there is a responsibility to put it into practice. Now, what is law in practice? Law in practice, to me, is an awareness. And so when I talk about advocacy, that's the awareness that I'm trying to get across so that people react by themselves and not being triggered when, you know, disaster strikes, as in that picture in the corner there. So when it's too late, in other words.
Yeah.
I think by advocating for the strength of international law through means other than universities to small elites of international law or diplomatic students, I think that's a good starting point. So if the ordinary person in the street, and I'm pretty sure, I think, you know, I came across a few people here and there in Tashkent, and it's interesting to see that when they ask me what I do. Obviously, I'm the tourist here and so on. I don't quite look like you guys, okay? So it's interesting when I say, well, I work on, you know, film with international law. Okay, film is a good word because that's understood, but international law is not something that's commonly known. By word maybe, but by content certainly not. And that's wherever I've been, wherever I go, it's the same experience. So I think getting this into the open, the civil society, to understand what it is also means subsequently, I think that's the key part here, that we increase the accountability towards those people who are abusing the law. Mm-hmm. Because if you have a human right, and you don't know about it, you think you're on your own. But when you think about it, an issue, that you realize, hang on, this is a right I have, then you will look for other people's opinions on the right, not maybe on your issue, and that empowers you. And I think it's exactly the same with international law.
You are a humanitarian law practitioner with many years of experience, from Geneva's institutional setting to field missions in conflict zones and areas where human rights abuses are unfortunately part of daily reality. What inspired you to turn to filmmaking as a form of advocacy and human rights communication? Where did this all come from? Do you have your personal experience or, I don't know, motivation or inspiration?
Look, I presume you're not funded by the UN, right?
Me?
Here, this setup.
No.
The reason why I'm saying that, also a bit in a joking sense, obviously, is because those institutions that I worked for, maybe in the, let's say, maybe two of my former employers are less visible worldwide. And this is the ICRC and the OSCE. So their advocacy is much more based on their clients, if you wish. But the United Nations is much vaster than that. And the United Nations has to adhere to its own principles. And one of them is to create awareness about human rights and other subjects. And the UN is generally doing a good job, considering that the United Nations doesn't actually have a lot of money. That's a total misnomer. A lot of people think that the United Nations is extremely well funded, even before these years now, those two wars, but it's not. In fact, I think it's about the size of the fire department of the New York. So if you think about that, okay, then they can't be everywhere at every time. But I think the UN is not very good at acting out its advocacy. Missions or projects and so on, because the United Nations is made up of nations. Some have a bigger influence in it than others, and we know the Security Council is one of the examples. So to maybe shorten my answer there, it's I think as a person, I was not satisfied with how we put messaging out there to as many people as possible that makes sense. I think we in the UN restrict ourselves to a certain target population, as we call them, and that restricts the output. Mm-hmm. So I decided I've had enough of these years of big international organizations, and I turned to filmmaking. And I think I have a bigger impact as a person, 100 times more impact than I would have had staying on in the UN. So this is really the reason why.
And your films, especially your latest one, Mandate, which will be screened here at several universities in Tashkent. What themes do they explore, and how do you see the connection between filmmaking, diplomacy, and education?
Yeah, here I have to go back a little bit, because my first film that gave me the impetus in becoming a filmmaker, if you wish, was called Broken Promises of International Law. In it, we filmed, documented, made testimony to a very clearly defined law case at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. So we filmed a case between Palestine and Israel at the example of the wall that divides those two countries, and how it goes through the whole United Nations system, starting at the Security Council, the General Assembly, and then into the court. And when it came out of the court 6 months later, it went back to the General Assembly, and it was actually very positively, to everybody's surprise, it was positively received by the international community, or the community of states, okay? But then nothing happened. So we started filming 14 years after that case, and we asked ourselves why nothing ever happened. But that we found these judges, they were very outspoken, and the case itself is extremely well presented in its format as a, call it a brochure, a book, or it's called an advisory opinion. So when that film came out in 2018, I started asking myself, why did these judges talk to us? Because normally, certainly not judges on higher courts like the Supreme Courts and so on, they don't talk to the media. Beyond the hour-long film, we got 88 hours of archive material from judges and experts on international law, and they speak.
What did they say?
Well, that comes into the second film. They're actually giving opinions. Like, actually, if I could do this again, I would write it differently. A court case. That's not usually what the judge says to you, okay? There are other things that were, the German judge, for example, he said, there were some moments where he was personally attacked by the Washington Post, just because he was German. So these are really deeply personal things that you would not expect from a judge. So what I'm saying with this is, we started researching the reasons why they spoke so directly, sometimes critical of themselves, certainly critical also of how the process evolved, and certainly critical about the fact that nothing ever happened. And so in the new film, we're looking at, or we're using this, you could call it a hypothesis if you wish, we're looking at how this outspokenness translates into an action. Because they knew they were speaking in front of a camera. Yeah. It wasn't like a tea party or something somewhere. So they were fully conscious, and they didn't censor us at all on what they said, even years later. So we were going back, and we're looking at what they said and how they said it, and we realized, this is our conclusion, we realized that we believe these judges gave us mandate. And this is where the film's title comes from. They were not satisfied with the outcome of their ruling work and opinion, so they felt they give it to us. Because at least us, we take it to the world, through the cameras and so on, right? So this is how we conceived of the idea of the mandate. Of course, there's many other aspects to the film that are very different and so on. But that is the crucial moment where we realize that, in fact, but when judges speak out as persons, because they're no longer judges in this case, then they become part of the international community. So we kind of reasoned that a judge talking to a camera because he's dissatisfied, I say he, because in that case it was mainly men, okay? He speaks out in dissatisfaction. well, they deliberate for 6 months and nothing comes of it. So this is like, they're demotivated, obviously. So they're giving us the mandate to speak about it through their voices, obviously, and then we take it in film format to a much broader audience, including educational institutions.
So your film showcasing their dissatisfaction from the current state of affairs in international law through, right?
No, it's not that
No?
The dissatisfaction is common to everybody. We know that a lot of things don't happen the way they should. But
what I'm saying is, what is your, how to say, the next action? Do you hope that their revelations will change the situation or will cause the discourse, the new discourse among
No, it has one effect, which is in itself, in effect, probably produced even without much of our input, but I think it's strengthening it, is the fact that we realized that the international community and the international law is no longer just based on states, but on people. And I think that is an interesting and extremely important factor if you want to have change in society or societies.
Well, cinematography is a form of art, right? And how do you see the potential of art forms for advocacy? Let's talk about the power of art in advocacy. In your opinion, how can communities, individuals, and organizations make use of it? And what is your general view on the inclusion of art, especially in documentary films, in this process?
Well, I think we're only moved by emotions. I think we can agree on that, okay? And how you evoke these emotions, feelings, maybe dissatisfaction and so on, is through, your senses or sensory organs. I think film is just extremely strong. You may recall the painting of Pablo Picasso about the Guernica, which is a big mural. And it was shocking at the time because he was able in one painting to show the ugliness of war. The problem is, when you've seen it once, you've seen it. Mm-hmm. And with film, you discover more as the film goes on. Sometimes you can go back. Sometimes you can cut stuff out of film or other media to be able to highlight something. So film has probably the most to offer in terms of education and advocacy in the same as a tool, right?
And there might be people who are interested in documentary filmmaking, especially in the field of humanitarian law and human rights. What would be your advice to those who are eager to uncover or expose human rights abuses happening in their countries?
Quality of film.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean for you?
Well, it means to me, I've just recently come back from Albania from the European premiere of my film. It was a human rights film festival. Mm-hmm. The quality of the films were very, very high, okay? But there were a couple of films, and this is not to point out the film itself, they were very well intentioned. But I thought in many of them, especially human rights related films, and I'm sure you cover, the news in a way that usually shows the bad sides of human beings and the positive sides get a little bit sidetracked. And there was a particular film, it was made by a dance group. It was technically extremely well made. Now I'm talking content first, okay? Yeah. So it was very well made, powerful, emotive, but after a while, it became repetitive. And when we had the question answer time afterwards with the filmmaker, I said, look, I really appreciate the kind of work that you put into this, but I can tell you're dancers. And he was a choreographer. And the film was about dance and illustrating people in prisons. So very powerful imagery. You couldn't do this in any other way that strongly, I think. The problem was that after a while I said, I was in prisons. sorry, maybe not, I have to explain. I was working in prisons for the Red Cross, you know, and you see scenes in prisons. And what me, as a witness of these scenes, that are not witnessed by anybody else except for the guys that have put them into prison, right, is the resilience of people. And that resilience, they didn't film. And I said, that's at the loss of your film. Because without showing resilience, to show tragedy, okay, then you know you can just watch TV all day, because that's exactly what we see. It's the tragic aspects, and it's very often underreported how people actually survive certain things. I mean, one of our judges, actually two of our judges, were that we filmed were in the Holocaust. They were actually in Auschwitz, and I think the senior one of them, the one maybe a little bit better known to the public, was a survivor of Auschwitz and was 11 years old when he came out. And for me, I met at his, not funeral, but at his commemoration in Germany, I met with his son. And I was really surprised at, you know, the deep conviction of this man to do good, because he's seen at 11 years of age the worst that you can see in anybody's lifetime, all right? And so that translated into a very positive thing. Yeah. And that's the resilience, I mean. And we all have it. You know, we may not always realize it, but if something happens really bad to you, you may discover yourself from a side that you've never seen, which I think is a very positive thing. It's not nice to survive certain things, maybe, but you know. But in general, and that's what I say. This film and many others have a tendency of being mediatic, if you know what I mean, right? It's kind of the instant, and it's whatever. It's a story.
Like action first, you mean?
Yeah, and then it doesn't show you where's the way out of this. And you're asking me this, okay? You're asking me how can we influence people, how can we make things better? I probably haven't asked all of this yet, but we'll hopefully come to it, because I'm a very, very motivated person, because I feel it's that trait in the human beings, that will to live.
So what you're saying is that to make successful documentary film, the technicalities are important, but also the narrative. What are you trying to show? Like the hero's individual, I would say, traits, maybe like resilience.
Well, I tell you where I think we go wrong in the film industry. A lot of films are treated as projects, and the project has a project cycle. It has a life to itself. You have to have a budget. And once you have a budget, you have to stick to the project description. In film, that is so sad, because you learn through the process of making a film. You should be able to extend it, and not all producers have the financial means or the stamina to say, let's go on and do it anyway. So they have a foregone conclusion at the end of the film. And that's what I find is really not good for the film industry, and it's certainly not good if you want to transport, you know, knowledge and create knowledge and spread awareness. So.
And what is your favorite documentary film in your area, apart from your works?
Okay, I don't know, because I don't hardly ever watch films except when I get exposure to them in years, because it's not. I don't want to become a filmmaker. I want to become somebody who can get education out there. So I'm the wrong person to ask this in that sense. Now, of course, I obviously enjoy certain films and so on. And I may not answer the first question, but I don't have an answer to that. But I do have something that might be of interest to your viewers. And that is when the calamity started in the Middle East, okay? I had just been asked whether I could do a film on the the second big court case of Israel-Palestine, which was ruling on the occupation, which is much bigger. It has much bigger impact on civilians and people in general than the war, obviously. And that had just been released last year in July. And it was a very positive note because it was the first time that the perpetrators in this case were actually taken to court over the fact that this occupation has been going on for far too long. Because according to the Geneva Conventions, you're allowed, if you wish, militarily to occupy another people and their territory, but it has to be reasonable and for a reasonable of a time until stability sets in. And during that time, you have to look after the civilians, the civil society, as much as if they were free. Okay, which of course we know it's not happening. But they asked me about would I make a film about this. And I said, okay, so we were in discussions when I got a phone call from London, somebody asking me on behalf of a barrister's office. They asked me whether I would cut together the footage from telephones from Gaza. And at that time I said, well, I'm not sure why you're coming to me. They had a reason for this, okay? They trusted me because of the film material that I have delivered. So they took this as they said to me, look, we as a barrister's office are only helping the South Africans creating this court case that should show genocidal intent of Israel versus Palestinians. And I said, okay, they had money for this, somebody in Dubai would have paid for it and so on. The footage that they wanted was to take pictures like these, and pictures as in videos, and put them together in a string of about 10 minutes in order to show the court the impacts of the war on civilians and what was happening in Gaza. Mm-hmm. And I said, I think that's a bad idea. If you use the same way to show the problem in Gaza as the Israelis do, and you may recall at the General Assembly, Netanyahu with all these paintings and Sharon before him, they always showed a picture and stuff of what's happening and film and what have you. I said, you don't have to do this. Every child on this planet saw these pictures. So they stopped doing this. They had a much better case after that, I believe. So this is why I think it's important to really look at film as its biggest potential and not to shy away from saying, no, this is not a good idea.
Let's dive into the topics and let's talk about the state of international humanitarian law and human rights law. Why do you think the topic of international human rights law is so often overlooked in the context of international relations or even intentionally hidden? It often seems there is a certain tension between diplomacy and, between the field of human rights and diplomacy. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, a lot of them, if we have time. But I'll give you the shortest version possible. First of all, when we here, I think, talk about international law, it's international law related to conflict, which houses different types of bodies of law. So predominantly it's the Geneva Conventions and the human rights treaties. But it's also enshrined in refugee law and so on. So this is what we're talking about when we say international law. This is not about, telephone companies making deals across borders and so on. So this is really when it comes down to conflict or war. I think the point that I made earlier on about education is, do you remember I used the word elite? Mm-hmm. I think that's the problem. That it's taught to elites who believe then they are the elites and nobody else understands what they're doing and saying. So when you have diplomats, I'm not saying all of them, certainly not, there's some brilliant guys out there, but by and large you have a lot of diplomats that are more interested in their own career than they are interested in creating something new or undigging something and so on and so forth. How I know? Because I had a project in the Palestinian territory which was called the Barrier Monitoring Project. It took many years to get it where it was, but it was 3 years long. It was funded by the Swiss government, housed in the UN, and I took diplomats out at least twice a day. Be it just for a few meters outside of our office where you could see the wall and so on, and I was deeply disappointed. I feel, and this I have shared with human rights experts, I felt that some of the diplomatic corps know the price of whiskey in different duty-free shops better than the Geneva Conventions when they're in places where they are applicable. That's very, very sad. And I know what I'm saying is very controversial in some ways, because it takes away from all these really good diplomats and great academics and so on. But by and large, I think it's a domain where the human being is not at the center. Mm-hmm. And how can you think about human rights if you don't think about human beings? It becomes abstract. And that is probably to the detriment of anybody living in this planet. Because it's a people-centered law, but it's dehumanized. And if you do that, then you think about articles and stuff in textbooks and law books and so on, and you forget that actually there are people behind this. And I think that empathy is lacking. That's hugely lacking from the diplomatic side, okay? Because how can you argue for people if you don't even get that basic understanding for people? And by and large, these people have gone through good universities, they have very nice lifestyles, but they forget a little bit about the people that don't have that. And they can't empathize with that. And
you've described your film, as for whom, I quote, international law matters, framing it as a battle for the relevance of international law. Do you think that today the relevance of international law, especially international human rights law, is showing signs of decline? And what might be the reasons behind that? Maybe you've already told about this, I think, but if you have something to add.
Yeah, no, I think it's not the law that's declining. It's the willingness to implement that law. Yes, that I've said before, but I think it's good to reiterate that. Because a lot of people saying, well, if it doesn't work, let's just throw it out, like with the baby and the bathwater, okay? Mm-hmm. And we had a very interesting discussion amongst human rights people this morning. And clearly, and they were from Uzbekistan and some internationals, and all of us totally agreed that it's not the law that's the problem, it's the politics. But how do you define the influence on politics on law? Well, basically, law decides what politics should mean. Okay? Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about policies and stuff. And so that for me is where, where a bit more of education will help, at least for us to understand that it's not the law that's the problem, but those that are kicking it with their boots.
And we often hear calls and discussions from different sides, international organizations, civil society representatives, and the public saying that the international community must act. Mm-hmm. But what exactly is the international community, and who are its main actors, and why is it so often blamed for inaction, especially in the context of ongoing human rights abuses? And yeah.
Advisory opinion, in this case that we filmed, mm-hmm. There is an emphasis on the role of the international community if the two warring sides or multiple warring sides do not find a way to implement the recommendations. And that's where, you have to ask yourself, so who are they? It was the international community that failed Palestine. Nobody else. You can't expect Israel not to fail Palestine. That's why they're at war. But the international communities, by and large, sitting on their hands, not doing anything. Has to do with what I just told you earlier on, that I think that diplomacy is really a lame duck. It's more about self-interests than the interests of somebody else, until it comes to your own problems. And then you want to need international community to help you. Then you realize it's important. We went really deep in our thinking process about the mandate. And we came up with the one solution. I did touch on it earlier on, but I think it's really interesting to point it out again, is to say, when a judge, who is no longer a judge, argues for the implementation of international law and has the power to say so, because they were judges there, then he becomes a civilian or an ordinary citizen. Mm-hmm. And he's no longer a judge who sits on the fence. And that's kind of crucial, okay? So I think when they spoke out to us because they knew they are the international community. Because the other partners in this political game, states that form the United Nations, don't see themselves as being responsible because there are probably too many. Mm-hmm. So, one hides behind the other. So here, it's a definition of international community, which less and less works because most countries don't actually act on behalf of somebody else, they act for themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's not a very nice way of going, because it means that people suffer more and more.
And let's talk about the media. Mm-hmm. And its role. It's clear that especially in cases of human rights abuses, international law, narratives play a huge part in shaping public perception. Yeah. Don't you think that the media holds great power yet also faces certain limits? And for example, in the case of Palestine, we could see how the discourse has shifted over time, and what, in your view, caused this change in narrative?
Oh. Yes, maybe an associate professor of humanitarian diplomacy, but this is a big question, all right? Because this is the reform of the UN, basically. Because if the UN is reformed, then the media can attach itself to a player that could be seen as ordinary good news and not fake news, okay? So that's just an opinion of mine, right? But that's not the only point here. Media houses are paid for very often by public funding, private funding, whatever, interests. And so if you look at the media scene in America at the moment, and you look at Late Night Show and so on, you see that people are being kicked out one day and the next day are reinstated. That's not media anymore, because a media, by the definition of the word, is a medium between either those that are filmed or interviewed and those that would like to gain access to their thinking and so on. So that's the medium. It's like a moderation, okay? That's what you're doing, right? But I think we've lost that. We've lost that largely because of the huge financial interests in the media. Now, media is a large term, as we know. It's not just what you're doing here, for example. It's also that which runs Hollywood, because they are the ones that define the next generation of how we look at the world and how we see the world and how many Barbies we produce and so on. So the independence of media can only be guaranteed either through the United Nations with legislation, which we have a lot of, but it needs to be implemented again, or through the state. But in many states there is an absence of being able to do that because the state controls the media. So, so I see myself as a filmmaker somewhere in there, and maybe just to say that how we cope with this is twofold. One is the way we do things, and the other one is, for example, our original logo said advocacy productions, dare to imagine, okay? Dare to film, dare to imagine. And a few years later, I realized how much influence, including over human rights filmmakers, this meta-level, interest in forming public opinion and so on is. So we call ourselves Advocacy Productions, truly independent. Because independent in our industry could be a lot of things, okay? But truly independent has a certain extra value in this. And when I'm saying this, it's because human rights films, I checked out a good number of them. They're not necessarily paid for by, especially in that it's not a rich industry, there's no money in it. But human rights films are not usually paid upfront for the whole process. They need to get money back on the distribution, which is true for Hollywood films as well, right? When you look at upfront where their money comes from, it looks like, pretty independent and so on, in congruence with human rights. And when you see who the distributors are, you realize the numbers of these film producers shrinks down to a small number enough, and then you can see that the same guys like Warner Brothers own subsidiaries who are then distributing those films. So they're not independent filmmakers anymore because they have to cater for a certain public, assumed probably, that will like that human rights film. And then it's it's questionable whether they are as independent as we are. But we are only independent because we don't make any money out of it. It's a non-for-profit organization. It's a company, but that has to do with contracts. So by and large, the only person that gets money from us is the film editor and nobody else, not even the cameraman. They're all working towards this because they believe in it.
So I think my next question related to that, and as far as I understood, being a documentary filmmaking in the field of human rights, international law is quite challenging. And you often have to tell people stories amid geopolitical tensions and politics, as you said, and maybe challenge authority or highlight issues that are not always trendy, even within human rights discourse, and are often underrepresented. And how do you approach such situations in your work? As you said, being independent, maybe there are other things, like you may also share an example from your professional experience. How to be independent, I guess.
Yeah. Again, I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask the whole palette of questions that are implicit in this. But I can tell you that I think the biggest obstacle to our work was the fact, nobody knew about international law, and nobody makes films about international law. There are filmmakers that make films about human rights, and human rights are part of international law. But international law, the way we use it here, is about courts, ideas, the philosophy of law, and so on. It's not about stories. The story may be, inherent in a court case and so on. So we're literally, and that I found out much later, we're the only film company in the world that makes films on international law, exclusively. We do nothing else. So we try to strew our films and the methodologies in such a way that we cover a huge amount of potentially audiences by making these films in a very different way. So our next film, for example, will be an animated film on the lack of water, and this is certainly an interesting topic for this country, the lack of water and access to water and how it's used and so on, as an international law. And we're talking about the region here, right? And we illustrate that through dance. So it's a dance movie. And so the topic will be interesting to many. And then the fact that it's a dance movie will bring in people that may be more inclined to have music and so on and so forth. So this is how we try to create as much awareness as we can.
Through creative approaches,
Yeah.
through arts.
Yeah.
And you are currently on a tour, delivering lectures to Uzbek audiences and students. What is the main message you would like to leave with them, and more broadly, what do you hope Uzbek audiences will take away from your visit?
Well, the visit I don't know, but I certainly now know what I would like to arrive at with my film work, okay? And this includes, for example, this evening a lengthy discussion among filmmakers in this country.
In Uzbekistan?
Yes, to see whether we can give some of our ideas that I just told you, especially the mechanisms of advocacy and so on. How can I leave this here, right? Mm-hmm. Now, will I find out in the next few days? No, of course not. But I may find out when somebody approaches me in a few weeks' time and says, listen, Stefan, I had an idea for a film and I think I could do with some help from you. Then, of course, that's what I do. And I don't charge for these things, okay? Mm-hmm. I think that's how I hope that we have some kind of impact here. With the students, I can tell you, those that were keen may, as in the past, write an essay or a thesis. It could be international law or diplomacy or international relations student. And I said, if you want to use the film as a starting point, where a certain moment in the film gives reason for you to couple this with your thesis, then we've been publishing theses with students forever. So these are very tangible things, okay? Then on the other hand, we had somebody who was blind in one of the sessions, and she said something extremely charming about the film. She said, I was able to see the film because it's so clear what they're saying. And I thought, I asked her to write this for me, and then we use this again in other environments and so on. So this is a two-way process. I'm learning tremendously interesting things that are relevant to me in my work, mm-hmm. And I hope that it's the same for people here, that they will, get something out of it that may last for as long as it will.
It's like an exchange between you and the students and Uzbek audience. Sure. And how can media professionals contribute in the documentary film industry? Do you think that there is a potential for collaboration? Well,
there is anyway, mm-hmm. because filmmakers will use material from you, from media makers in their films. They usually are very good at quoting this, so that's not a big deal, I think. I don't know how it is with archives, because you're just one media outlet now, but let's say we have media outlets, especially in the written format, where giving access to filmmakers for free will help. Because I've been refused recently, a newspaper in Luxembourg refused me to get what I said in my interview. For whom? Are they going to make money out of me? I'm in Geneva. I'm not reading a Luxembourg paper. But that's one of the ways, I think, which could support filmmakers in doing this. The other thing is, I'll show you an example in my work. We have a film that will also come out next year if all goes well. It's called The Curious. The Curious is a film based on my film Broken that targets 14-year-olds. So we looked at the physiognomy of the brain of 14-year-olds through experience, obviously, not through a scan. And we came down on the thing that, yes, we can use this film, but they need some extra information for it. So what's the Security Council and so on. So we're explaining, before the scenes, we explain those things that they will be likely to be exposed and ask themselves questions about. It's a huge project. And we had 4 such segments, and I'm coming to the media. The last segment is well, okay, there's the last segment of the film, and then there is an extra segment, and that is beyond the film. And that is about the media, the role of the media. And our idea is to film media makers, newsmakers, and so on, influencers, to tell us in a simulated webinar on Zoom what the media feels about international law and what the media can offer to ameliorate that. And the last question is the crucial one. How can young people protect themselves from fake news? And that has been taken up by an NGO in Switzerland called Hirondelle, which is the swallow, right? They have tons of newsmakers and so on, predominantly in the radio industry, and they are in like 50 countries or something like that. And we want to tap into that. But of course, people like yourself, you're more than welcome to come and work with us on this, because that is, I think, a very challenging last question there. And we hope to get as many newsmakers as possible on it, so that we have a broad spectrum of answers to young people. Well, there you go.
And my last question is, do you have any closing thoughts on how individuals and societies can contribute to building a culture of peace through international law? And in your view, what values are essential for sustaining that culture, both at the personal and institutional level?
Okay, the last one is politics, and you have to regulate that. I mean, if presidents of the biggest power in the world break their constitution, we're really at the bad end, okay, at the moment. So this is not something that people can do anything much about. But I think, as we said, it's first and foremost the idea that young people will be told, and the civil society in general, how to understand international law as a factor of life, not just a hobby or something, okay? I think that's important. I say to the students here in the universities and elsewhere, I said, don't sit on your hands. Do something about it. If you feel strongly about this, do something. You can. Because doing this type of public campaigning, doesn't have to start at a media conference or something. That could be done by students, it could be done by interest groups, it could be done by whoever. If we don't do this in countries, anywhere, Uzbekistan and others, we don't create an awareness for international law in conflict, nobody will ever get food to Gaza again. I'm being very dramatic here, but if we in our countries do not put our potential might together, then nobody will. I mean, to see that people are starving in front of the camera, that is unacceptable. So everybody has to do something. We have to live with ourselves in a few years' time when we go back and say, what did I do during that time?